few years ago, it was actually about 2020. For about a year, I started a practice. I was reading the prophets in the morning for devotions, not always a good idea. And then I was reading at night. I'd go online and I'd read 3 or 4 newspapers from different parts of the country just to see what was happening. I didn't have anything in mind, but I could not have chosen a worse or a better time, because the time that I chose to do this was the same time that the country was going into lockdown. They were seized by fear of COVID. About that time, there was a series of murders of people of color in different parts of the country, which part of the result for that was sometimes protest and sometimes riot. Later that year, you recognize there were a lot of questions over the political process. Was it a fair and legitimate election? And then that was followed by an assault on Capitol Hill. And then we started hearing stories of a border that was opening up and hundreds of thousands coming across every month. We were getting stories about violence and homelessness and mental illness being on the rise. And all the while this was happening, I was reading the prophets in the morning, and I was reading the news at night, and I had no intention at all to try to make something of this. I wasn't ever thinking about speaking on it. I would have chosen to avoid it, and I did for like 3 years. But the more I read in the morning and night, the more they started to talk. I started to notice these prophets, well, they were different from all of the pundits that I was hearing in the public. The prophets that were speaking were strange creatures. They were eccentric beings. But they ran on 2 rails. One of those rails was that they had piercing insight into what was wrong with their nation, and they were not afraid to say these things in front of power. But right next to that, on the other rail, is they had this wild and this holy imagination. They could paint vivid pictures of what the world would look like when Yahweh was king. I noticed that they were fiercely political and social preachers. They were not like a lot of us, afraid of politics and religious circles. They spoke of them, but never directly. They never talked about current events. Instead, they used current events and pulled them into a larger narrative about a conflict between Almighty God and whatever power was present at the time. So they were never just giving commentary on things. They were calling Israel back to its spiritual foundation. They never were interested in justice for justice' sake. They wanted justice because it came out of the covenant that Yahweh had made with his people. And so their first response to this injustice was never anger, it was grief. They led the nation in seasons of lament, and they told the nation to wait for Almighty God to deliver them. Are you hearing me? So, and as I was reading this, I started to see an entirely different way to interpret maybe what was happening in the times. They were Chesterton called them unpractical men. He said, when something is moderately broken, you need a person who is used to the way things work to come in and tinker with the machine. But when things are very broken, you need some wild-eyed professor from the lab who wonders why there's a machine at all. You need, he says, an unpractical man. Someone who would just come with an entirely new idea that practical people never would have thought of. You with me so far? So I started reading these prophets, and I'm going to try to draw pictures for you this morning of one prophet in particular. It's the prophet Micah. Now, I'm not doing this so you don't have to read Micah, by the way. I'm doing this so you will read Micah. There's only 7 chapters. They're not heavy. They're full of metaphors. The language is evasive, but it's evocative. It'll pull something out of you. I'd encourage you to do it. Mike, I'm going to try to summarize the book for you. Can I do that? Well, I'm gonna. You might as well just give me permission. If I listen, Micah is one of those eccentric preachers. He says in chapter 1, verse 8, he says, for this reason, for all of our sins, for this reason, I will go about barefoot and naked, and I will wail like a jackal and moan like an owl. Imagine if you invited your friend to college church and the pastor got up barefoot and naked. And when he was worked into a lather, he moaned like a jackal and wailed like an owl. You would be like, he's like a Lions fan in October, man. Everything is wrong. So Micah says the problem with the nation, this is the nation, by the way. How's that? He said the problem with the nation is that it has an incurable wound in verse 9, chapter 1, verse 9. He says in chapter 2, verse 10, the land is defiled and it is beyond remedy. In other words, there's something so systemically wrong with our nation that it cannot be saved. Well, what is this incurable wound? Well, he goes on to identify 3 different entities which are sort of like an unholy trifecta. In the midst of Israel, there are the leaders, there are the religious, and then there are the prophets. Now, the prophets are not always the religious. There were hundreds of prophets back in that day. Aaron Chalmers said, not just the 17 you know about in the Bible. There were literally 50 that we know about in the Bible and hundreds beyond that. And most of them didn't speak truth to power. Most of them said exactly what power wanted to hear. So the prophets in those days were like modern day celebrities today. They were a professional guild of speakers who knew how to hold people's attentions. They were like our version of famous comedians combined with talk show hosts, combined with big personalities, people that knew how to get the public to look at them. Now, these 3 powers, the leaders and the religious and the prophets, are not all in cahoots, says Micah, but they are all complicit with Israel's downfall. They're complicit because each one of these 3 entities, he says, has something to gain by things remaining as they are. And so while they speak eloquently about change, they privately protect the way things are because they have too much to lose by a new idea. You still there? So the leaders, he says in chapter 2, are those who plot evil in the evening, and in the morning they do what they planned. These are his words, because it is in their power to do so. They see a person's house and they seize it. They defraud a man of his inheritance because they have power over laws and processes and systems. And so they rig systems to fatten themselves at the people's expense. In chapter 3, he flat out says it. He says, these people pick the flesh off the bones of my people. They chop up my people like they're meat and put them in a pan. I should probably calm down. We're only 5 minutes into this thing. You can see the problem here, can't you? These people are protecting their interests. Now, they are also in an informal alliance with the religious. The religious are the priests and the moral teachers who, he says, teach and preach for money. That is, the preachers are always discerning, how far can I go without it affecting the offerings? I don't want to say anything that would tick the powerful, the rich, or the famous off, or there will be repercussions for our industry. You there? The prophets, he says, prophesy only what the people want to hear. And they model for the people an aberrant behavior that encourages the public to follow them. Now, these three do not necessarily like each other. In fact, they may hate each other. The leaders aren't fond of the religious, but they know that religious people have a lot of social power, and so they have to respect that, but they don't like them. And the religious are not fond of the prophets because they call them the world. They're the bad people. But because religious people often need somebody to hate. They need something to fix. They need something to be wrong, because that becomes for them a message and a platform. They will condemn the prophets all the while they tolerate them. And the prophets themselves are in the leaders' pockets. And so the leaders simply affirm what the prophets are saying. And is this starting to make sense? Now, I've not said anything about our country. And I won't say anything about our country. I worked hard keeping that out of this message. Because some in the room right now, you can only hear messages from a political standpoint. I've talked to some of you brothers and sisters. Every sermon I preach, you're trying to say, is that left, is that right? As if that were the only narrative. So I'm trying to leave that stuff out of here. I'm just going to tell you Micah and let you download the rest. That okay? So you start to see this unholy alliance, and because these people are in cahoots with each other, informally aligned with each other, needing each other, yet not liking each other, each one of them speaking for their own interests, each one complicit in the downfall, Israel has a series of problems. And this is when I went to all of the prophets, and I put all the prophets into a room, and I said, if they were just to say, you know, Steve, here's what bugs me about my nation, there would sort of be an index to the things the prophets are all talking about. I'm going to write them up here for you. One of those is moral confusion. You know, do you know what that is? Isaiah says they call evil good and good evil. They call bitter sweet and sweet bitter. They've lost the capacity to blush, is what Jeremiah says. Beyond that, there is an economic injustice. There are laws and there are systems that keep people into an economic strata or caste system that they can't get out of, because the rich, the religious, and the famous have something invested in keeping them there. Beyond that, there is corrupt power. And by that, the prophets speak about judges, they speak about courts, systems, laws. Beyond that, there is the pursuit of idolatry. Micah says they worship things they have made with their own hands. Beyond that, there is a religious hypocrisy. And this is what makes it so dangerous, you guys, is because the people doing this are not irreligious people. These are people with meticulous, even conservative spiritual disciplines. So whenever you go to poke at them and say, how can you do that? They retreat to this kind of religious ecosystem that they've created. And then beyond the religious, I think Isaiah says, they draw near with their mouth, but their hearts are far from me. There's a hypocrisy. And the last thing I'll put up here, I don't have words for this. Those are too big words. Sorry, this is Sunday morning. How about if I just call it sort of a blind nationalism? What I mean is, at the end of the day, they all believe that Israel is an exceptional nation. If other nations have these problems, well, you would understand that. But not us, because we are God's people. So whenever the prophet speaks to them, they just kind of step back and hide behind that "we are God's people" narrative. Are you with me so far? This is sounding really negative. I'm trying to hurry so those of you that are addicted to positivism will be able to breathe by the end. I want to make a couple things clear before I tell you Micah's answer. Micah says, this is not the incurable wound. These are symptoms. This is the incurable wound. It's incurable because the same people that you would turn to reverse the downfall are themselves responsible for the downfall. It's incurable because the physician himself is sick. So what are we going to do? Well, there were some in the crowd that were saying, I know what we'll do. We'll start a revolution. We'll light everything on fire, burn it down, and start over. And there are still some who preach this. There are others that come and say, well, I know what we'll do. We'll have a reformation, or what Americans call elections. Rats, there's one. We will call all of the nation back to the ways of Yahweh. This is who the Pharisees were. What we need is a return to the Torah. Everybody just do the law. There were others that said, no, what we need is a national revival. Those were Wesleyans. All right, I picked on us. Micah says God has another idea that nobody has thought of. God is going to form a nation within a nation. And he'll call it a remnant. What the prophet says is, listen to his language. I think it's in chapter 4-ish. He says, the remnant will come from among the peoples. The remnant will be among the nations. The remnant that God is forming is a nation within the nation. And it has, says the prophet, a different king, and it has a different kingdom. It follows a different way. This is what the prophet says. When God forms this remnant, he will give them a new king. And the king will go before them, and he will break open the way, and Yahweh will be at his head. The prophet says the king will come from a little city called Bethlehem, and he will become the ruler of my people. And he will shepherd my people in mercy, and they will follow him and live securely, because the extents of his kingdom will be from one end of the earth to the other, and he himself will be their peace. He is talking about a kingdom with no borders. There is no one ethnicity, no one language. There is no one culture, no one way. It is people from every nation, every culture, every language, every ethnicity, but one king. And they don't always agree, but they all love their king. And the union that these people will have with each other will be in and through their king. What a dream. Wow, when the people heard this, chapter 6, they said, how are we going to, we love this idea. This will be the answer to all of these symptoms, because these people will be an island of life in a nation that is dying, and they will attract people to themselves. They said, I want in. How do I get in? What they're asking is, what is the way into God's heart? Who are the people of God? Now, it is right here when you ask yourself that you must not ask religious people, because religious people always draw the circle with them in it. And you can see how this community that God is forming is still part of the larger nation. So they're not out somewhere else on an island like Amish just protesting everything. These are people that live within the nation or the neighborhood that they're trying to change, but they are a social alternative. And so they seem to people that are in the other nation to be eccentric only because they have a different center. That's all it means. To these people, the religious establishment is a concentric circle, and to these people, the people of God is an entirely different circle. So you always see tension between the established church and the people of the remnant. And that's true today, and this is not a political statement. People that God is calling into the remnant today sometimes are the people with the fiercest criticism for the established church, because they see the church today as simply a reflection of the consensus among the public. They see the problems in the public to be the problems of the church, but there is a community that God is calling that is still within the nation, but they have a different king and a different way of life. And what is this way? Well, said the prophet, there are three qualities. One is they love and practice justice. Another is they love mercy. And the third is that they walk humbly with their God. It turns out these three qualities, justice, love, or hesed in the Hebrew, and walking humbly, or in the Hebrew, a humble attentiveness in one's walk with God. It turns out that these three qualities are as old as the law of Moses. This is why the prophet said, "He has shown you, he has told you what is good, O man. It is to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with the Lord your God." He's simply saying, we have known this since the day this kingdom was founded, when Moses wrote the Constitution. In Leviticus and Deuteronomy, he told us how to live. So I went back to Leviticus, to what was called the Holiness Code, which, by the way, was codified the same time Micah was preaching. So that worked nice. And what Moses said was, this is how you should live. When you harvest, leave something for the poor. Do not defraud your neighbor. Be responsible to and for one another. Show hospitality to the alien or the immigrant, because remember, you were an immigrant one time. Do not show favoritism to the poor, and do not show partiality to the rich. No, judge each case on the merits of the case. Treat senior adults with dignity. And everybody in the back of the auditorium said, amen. And as I read this law in Leviticus 19, I started to see these three things: justice, love, and a humble walk with God as a portable way of carrying the entire law of Moses. Are you there? There's a second thing. I'm almost done. Relax. It occurred to me as I watched these things that these are not disconnected virtues. They are rather connected. So I'm going to draw one of Bo's favorite diagrams, a Venn diagram, to show that these three qualities, justice, love, and a humble walk with God, are irreducibly complex. That means they're not three different devices. They're three components to the same device. If you take one of the components away, the other two are neutralized. Think of a mouse trap. It only has about 3 or 4 parts. It has a base, a lever, a spring, and whatever that thing is where you put the cheese. If you take one of those components away from the mousetrap, the entire mousetrap is now compromised. That's how these qualities work. If you practice justice without love, you do not have justice. You have revenge. A get-evenness will make your life as miserable as my life. And yet, if you try to love somebody without walking humbly with your God, it will turn into self-interest. I don't love you, I love me. And it's in my best interest to pretend that I love you. But if my love is rooted in my walk with God, if my convictions come out of a dark room when God and I are talking, it is love of a different sort. And your private conversation with God that you love when you read your Bibles and your devotionals and your worship services, the prophet would say, if it does not move you to justice, if it does not move you to change the living conditions of the poor, the alien, and the one marginalized by some misfortune in life, they're ceremonially unclean, they're sick, they're a widow, they're an orphan. If your walk with God does not move you to some kind of justice, all you have is a false piety. What did Jesus say? These are the laws. Love God and love your neighbor. And by the way, there is no way to love your neighbor as you ought unless you love God as you could. And you do not really love God as you think unless you love your neighbor as you ought. You there? Said differently, your love for God is never any better than your love for others. Who is my neighbor? It's the poor, the alien, and those that are beaten down by situations in life. Love them, and God will know that you love him. Do you see it? Well, I got this far, you guys, and I started thinking, where's our church? I asked myself, what should be the emphasis of our church right now? I don't know the answer to this. That's why y'all are going to classes when this is over and having conversations with your friends, right? I mean, you're going to go somewhere, talk about this, I hope. Be nice. I hope you're going to ask yourself, what is God calling College Church to put their emphasis in next? Personally, this is just my opinion. I think we spend a lot of time on walking with God in humility. I think we try to contain egos. I think we spend a lot of time trying to discern God's will for our congregation and for our personal lives. And so that one I'm like, yeah, all right. Maybe we're batting 250, 280, you know. But then I look at justice. Is God calling us to be more active in seeking justice for those who are vulnerable? Or is God calling us to actually know the people that are vulnerable? Name them, be friends with them. You can love justice for justice's sake and never love people. We have. I have. So where is God putting the emphasis? And we can't answer that right now, but here's one you can answer. Where is God calling you to put your emphasis as an individual or as a family? Spouses. Are you using your voice? Are you using your platforms and your resources to bring about justice for those who are most vulnerable? This is true worship. Do you know who they are? Do they feel seen? Do you feel them? And do you know their situations? Or do you have a hidden life? Do you have a private altar that no one sees with disciplines and sacrifices that you never talk about, ever? It's an altar that God just keeps hidden. But that altar for you is the fountainhead of everything that you do. You pull away with God, he speaks to you, and you say, no matter the cost, I will do that.